Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide. Chapter 5.
Herod's house in the city was quiet, but a few lights remained to tell me not everyone had turned in for the night. My old friend occasionally graced the city with his presence, and it did not surprise me that he was here at this advantageous time. Knocking on the door, it took a few minutes for a servant to answer. Bleary-eyed, he ushered me into their anteroom while he alerted Herod to his guest. I helped myself to a plush settee near an empty fireplace. In the cooler months, that room would have been a welcome spot to warm yourself after traversing the cold streets of Jerusalem. That night it was dark and felt very empty, cold even. Fortunately, as Herod entered the room, I could see on his face his greeting would not be so. He embraced me and was immediately concerned as to what brought me to his home at such an hour. Being the man of means that he was the first to bring up the Jewish rabble as a possible cause. As he joined me at the cold fireplace, seated on his own settee, I began recalling all the events I'd witnessed over the last few days. Accompanied by a single light in the room, I felt as if I was telling stories of our childhood that we used to scare each other with. There was a sense of levity then. It was not the same at this moment. Herod looked intrigued and concerned. Once I'd relayed everything I knew, he informed me that this was not the first time he'd heard of the prophet Jesus. Apparently, Jesus and his band of misfits had been spending a lot of time in Herod's territories. He had, on more than one occasion, been visited by the upset Jewish elders of multiple provinces. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to see that Jesus had not kept his troublemaking just to Jerusalem. Herod confirmed to me what I had already assumed. He was not in a place where he could do anything about Jesus. All the trouble Jesus was stirring up at the temple was under the watch care of Pilate. Herod wasn't about to cross lines with someone he already had so much enmity with. We both knew Pilate as a man that overcompensated for his shortcomings by lording his power over the Jews he ruled. We had seen him drum up charges on multiple men and Jews alike just because he didn't like them. One day he would reap the terror he sowed in the city. You can only play with fire so long. Herod assured me that he would take this issue to heart and see something done. Just as we began to talk plans, a soft knock came at the doorframe at the entrance to the room we occupied. Herod's personal assistant profusely apologized for interrupting, but had urgent news. Word had spread that the Jews themselves had taken Jesus from the Mount of Olives near where he was encamped. Nobody knew where they were keeping him or what they had planned. Knowing the city would be restless with this news, Herod adjured me to stay the night for my safety. I accepted, as I had no desire to run into hot-blooded Jews looking to make a statement. I allowed Herod's assistant to show me to a room and laid down to let the sun rise on a better mind to make plans.
I waited outside the doors of the high priest's home for at least an hour. I just couldn't draw myself away from what I'd heard coming through that door. My father's absolute hatred in every word I heard him shout. And the grunts of that man, whom I could only assume was beaten and brutalized behind those closed doors. Beaten and brutalized by men I revered, by my father. Father would only go to that extreme if there was no other option, if he felt this person threatened everything he held dear. I didn't have to see into that room. I knew it was Jesus. They'd found him. They'd first found their inside man, and he had led them to Jesus at the time that they could take him without much trouble. There, behind those closed doors, they were pouring out all of the wrath that they had built up since Jesus rode in on that donkey through the gates of our city. He'd become such a threat to them that they even eschewed their faith practices to take Jesus by surprise. As the sun lit up the square and a few fires that were left were dampened and people left to begin their day, I heard shuffling and voices coming from inside the house. The towering guards turned to open the doors, and through them walked all the elders, Father among them. They'd taken time to clean themselves up, adorn themselves in fresh, clean robes, and adjust their countenances to an air of indifference and superiority. Perhaps it was because of that the man that trailed behind them between two guards, why he stuck out so much. He was bowed over in pain. His hair was disheveled, blood on his tunic. His breathing was ragged, and he limped as he practically was dragged through the door. For all the victory that the elders seemed to be getting from the situation, I couldn't help but feel like something had gone terribly wrong. I watched as they led them to their official chambers across the square with the sun shining on their faces. The brightness the day brought with it created an eerie contrast to the darkness that I seemed to be witnessing. Surely Father would have a good explanation as to what had happened in those secret hours before dawn. Surely they caught him doing something so terrible that he deserved what they had dealt out. I apparently wouldn't learn their motivation at the moment, as Father didn't even seem to see me as he passed. Stunned and wordless, I just watched the group walk away. It wasn't until the procession started drawing the attention of others in the square that I felt my body begin to move again. I fell in with the curious onlookers. I joined the line of people intent of seeing how this show played out.
I was woken early by one of Herod's men. He informed me that Herod was already down in the dining room awaiting my arrival. News had arrived early that I would be very interested in. I dressed quickly and descended the stairs to the dining room. Herod sat there with a plate of fresh fruit as one of his men was relaying information to him. Seeing me enter, he waved the man off, nodded at me, and slid a chair out from under the table with his foot. Taking that as an invitation to sit, I pulled the chair further out and joined him. As the servants brought me my own plate, Herod told me of the news that got him up early. His men had confirmed that Jesus had been taken in the middle of the night by Jewish elders and had been sequestered in the home of the high priest during the early morning hours before dawn. The latest on the situation was that Roman guards had witnessed the elders leaving the home of the high priest with a man in tow, a man that had been beaten so badly they could not recognize his face. At that, Herod looked at me knowingly. They had finally done something about him. Under the cloak of darkness, following one of their holy days no less, they had dealt Jesus some backroom justice. I sat back in my chair and popped a grape in my mouth. For once, those Jews were handling their own business and not crying to the nearest Roman authority for help. Perhaps the day would be a great day. My city would be returning to normal without that Jesus around.
I was growing used to little sleep. Most nights I slept in fits and starts, doing my best to not wake up Hannah and the others in the tent. That particular night, sleep never came. Mary and I were up late waiting on word of Jesus' whereabouts. The men were frantic as Peter had disappeared too. We laid down to try and recover some rest right before the sun broke on the horizon. I laid there and all I could do was silently pray. I prayed for Jesus, for his men, for God to intercede and cover his people with his mighty wings of protection. I prayed for Hannah and for what God had in store for her. I prayed over the women in our camp. If Jesus was lost to us, then we were yet again under threat. I asked God to help me in my time of fear, for I had so much fear about the days to come. As I closed my prayer, I could hear others doing the same. We had all forgone sleep for prayer and were hoping for that to sustain us that day. With the sun shining into our tent, I rose to try and learn the latest of the situation. Hoping for the best, I lifted the flap of the tent to see the men of our camp in tears yet again. I approached them with trepidation. Their tears meant Jesus was still in danger, that we were still in danger. One of them was relaying what they had witnessed this morning, along with Peter, who we came to learn had followed Jesus after his arrest. That man had stood watch at the high priest's home where they had hidden Jesus away. He had last seen Peter when he was confronted by another Jewish man about his connection to Jesus. In an unusual form, Peter had denied any affiliation with Jesus and ran off from the square, leaving the other followers behind. Beyond that moment, no one knew his whereabouts. Jesus had called Peter his rock, had talked about his strength and leadership being what Jesus could count on to build his church. If Peter didn't have the fortitude to stand when called to account, would I possibly have the chance? The man continued, and his words made my legs grow weak. At the dawn of the day, at the very time that I had been laying there sleepless and praying, Jesus had been brought out of the high priest's home, paraded out of the front doors by the elders, broken and bleeding. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Despite their many disagreements, it was hard to believe that these revered men of the faith would stoop to this. And just hearing how they paraded him through the square as they approached their official chambers, the sheer pomp told me that they were reveling in their victory. The man knew no more past that moment. With the sun up, he knew he needed to come back and relay the events of the early morning to those of us who were still at the camp. Quickly, the men began drawing up plans to return to the chambers of the elders and wait for more information to come to light. Mary approached me on my right shoulder. Before saying a word, she grabbed my hand and squeezed. Apparently, she had been listening as well and knew what it meant. She did not offer me platitudes or assure me this time things would turn out all right. She just simply quoted a scripture from our Holy Torah. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you.
I knew the council room of elders was a closed proceeding. I stood at the foot of the building as more and more people gathered after hearing word of what had occurred in the square. Conversations varied from excitement to fear. As many followers as Jesus had that had come to our city, I could tell there were still plenty who hated him. Hearing noise from above me, I looked up to see one of the elders walk onto a small balcony to address the crowd. He told us that Jesus had committed the sin of blasphemy in claiming himself the Son of God and convincing Jews to follow him. He would be turned over to local authorities and be tried for leading a rebellion against them. People from the crowd immediately began yelling questions at the elder, and some began shouting for Jesus to be crucified. The elder only turned and walked back inside. Having to tilt my head up to see him, that reminded me of Jacob on the rooftop the other day. I immediately began combing the crowd for my brother. He had to be here. Before I got very far, the crowd began shifting. The front doors of the council chambers opened, and the parade began anew. They were taking Jesus to Pilate to file former charges against him. Jesus remained subdued, but had at least found the strength to lift his head and walk without gasping for air. He still held his side, and I could tell it was painful for him to move at the pace the elders had set. I followed the processional as they approached Pilate's residence. I'd hoped that I could get my father's attention during that time, but he, just as all the other elders, had a sense of pure determination that would not be interrupted. That, or, as I called his name repeatedly, he just assumed that I was my younger brother, and he was just ignoring my calls to him. Walking into the Roman sectors of the city always made me feel like an outsider. Their homes were built with fine stone that we Jews only ever could afford to use on our homes of worship. Lanterns lit the streets in the evenings, and you didn't see the debris lining the roads like you did around our home. We lived in separate worlds. We Jews and Gentiles, there's no way we'd ever understand each other. Which left me little hope that Pilate would be the solution to the problem. He was already known as a hothead and was just as likely to turn on the elders themselves as to punish Jesus for his crimes. Regardless of my personal fears, one of the lead elders knocked on the door of Pilate's home. When a man answered and inquired their business, he abruptly shut the door in the elder's face and disappeared. Moments later, though, 3 Roman guards marched out of those very same doors and drove the crowd back from the doorway. I watched as one of the elders shoved Jesus back down the stairs, almost making him tumble down. He remained on his feet, though, and lifted his head to see a man in full regalia breach the white stone doorway. Pilate was smaller than I imagined. A person heard stories of the fear he struck in so many, and I kind of created a character in my mind the size of Gaius himself. What I was looking at here did not measure up. But that's not to say he appeared weak, by no means. His stare was pure contempt as he took in the crowd at his door. Pointing at the elder who had knocked on the door, he demanded the man explain why this crowd had gathered. The elder motioned for Jesus to be brought forth, and while he was being pushed through the crowd, began laying out his argument to Rome. He claimed that Jesus had forbidden Jews to give their due to Caesar because he was the king that they were supposed to follow. And Pilate's eyes lit up at that. Crossing the might of Rome was no small thing, and Rome did not treat it as such. He looked at Jesus and asked him if he was the king of the Jews. Drawing a deep, ragged breath, Jesus' only response was, "You have said so." Well, Pilate seemed flustered at this. The words Jesus had spoken gave him no sure course of action. I could see his thoughts reeling for a swift decision. Huffing, he turned to the elders and stated that he had no course of prosecution. The elders insisted that Jesus was stirring up the people to unjust actions and seemed to be pressing hard on Jesus being the leader of a rebellion. They told him of all the things Jesus had been doing across the region and the trouble he had caused. Hearing these stories, it looked like Pilate realized that his jurisdiction was not the only one inside in which where these things happened. I could tell he was eager to get this crowd off of his front stairs, and it surprised me that he then told the elders to go seek out Herod, who had just happened to be in town. As Jesus' travels had brought him through Herod's territories, maybe he could find the charges necessary to end this. And with that, Pilate and his guards returned to the house and closed the door. Shoving Jesus back down into the crowd, the elders quickly made plans to find where Herod was staying. It was then I saw Jacob, this time in the heart of the press of humanity surrounding Jesus and the elders. I didn't know what to do. As close to Jesus and the elders as he was, I couldn't approach him. Father would see or Jacob would run. My only hope to intercept my brother would be to grab him somewhere on the road to Herod's house.
Something about Mary's scripture had lit a fire in me. There at the camp, knees weak with the news of Jesus' arrest, her words settled deep in my soul. He would never forsake me. He would always come through for me. I knew I could never measure up to that standard he had set, but I couldn't stand here crying tears that did nothing for him. Leaving Hannah in the care of the elder women at the camp, Mary and I followed the men into the city to intercept the elders at their council room. At the time we approached the square, an elder was addressing the crowd from a balcony above. He made claims that they had caught Jesus in an act of rebellion and would be bringing him before Pilate for justice. One of the men among us implored the elders to let us see Jesus, but he was ignored. The elder walked back inside, and very quickly the doors of the building opened to a procession of elders with Jesus in tow behind them. The guards to his left and right, not offering assistance for his broken state as they quickly walked towards the Roman quarter. Tears threatened to fall as I looked at Jesus. There, stumbling a broken man, bruised and beaten. It was hard to see the kind and gentle eyes of my Savior for the mats of hair that hung in his face. His huffs of pain, the only sound he made as I caught my breath every time a guard shoved him brutally. Our group followed, the already gathered crowd. Most of us remained quiet, taking in the scene. A few continued to try and get the attention of the elders without success. The elders had one focus, and that was to get rid of Jesus for good. There on the stoop of Pilate's home, I heard the lead elder claim outright lies about Jesus. He must have found boldness that he had not had before to so openly lie in front of a crowd that had most likely been there to hear Jesus' actual words. They knew if they could convince Pilate that Jesus had disparaged Rome and threatened its income, that is all it would take for Pilate to act. What conniving serpents. The men with us tried to tell Pilate it was all a lie, but their protestations were drowned out in the buzz of the crowd. It was obvious that not all of us here were for Jesus. Many seemed intrigued by the goings-on and only seemed to incite more derision among the people in tow. Some were even beginning chants of "kill him" and "get rid of him." Did they even know him? Had they even seen the things that he had done? How could they want him dead? Surely we hadn't arrived at that extreme conclusion yet? Pilate quickly passed us off to another Roman lord. I could tell this was turning into a public spectacle, and it seemed that is exactly what the elders wanted. As the crowd began to shift away from Pilate's door and wait for the next decision of the elders, I stared at Jesus. He wasn't fighting them, and had only said 4 words since our group joined the crowd. He wasn't looking to his people in the crowd, and he seemed resigned to his position of subjugation to these men. What was he doing? He was God in the flesh. Surely if he wanted to, he could call down the very angels from heaven and have this done with at any moment. But he didn't. He just turned and stumbled after the men, so intent on seeing him dead. What was I witnessing?
The crowd thinned out as they made their way to Herod's residence. Jacob had managed to move through quicker than I could, so I was trying to shift and slide my way through the crowd just to try and catch him. I could tell he was trying to stay as close to Jesus as possible. Close to Jesus, thereby close to Father. It was only so long before Father would see his son among the crowd of Jesus' followers. I had to move quickly.
I had remained at Herod's home for the morning at the behest of my old friend. I sent a message to Marcus to inform him I would be delayed in returning home, but spent no more time worrying about the usual business of my day. Marcus could handle it. I was in the presence of someone that just might be able to rid me of the headache that Jesus of Nazareth had become once and for all. Of course, I would stick around to hear what he could do. As if by providence, Herod did not have to act before the whole issue wound up at his door. Mid-morning had come, and there were the Jewish elders at his door with Jesus in chains behind them and a large crowd following. As we beheld the spectacle from an upper-story window, I turned to my friend with an eyebrow raised. I didn't have to ask for him to know what was on my mind. He summoned a servant and had him bring the elders and Jesus into that very same anteroom that we had occupied the night before. The room was still cold, and even with the lamps at each corner, the darkness seemed to wrap itself around each person standing there. I could see shadows moving outside the few windows. No doubt, people in the crowd were crushing in to hear what Herod would make of all this. Herod surprised me by speaking candidly to Jesus. He asked for details of the many stories he'd heard about him, relayed incident after incident that had been brought to him by elders in other cities and towns under his jurisdiction. His inquiry turned to mocking as Jesus refused to respond to anything Herod asked of him. The more Herod mocked, the more elders around Jesus drew mirth from the proceeding. I found myself entertained by Herod's joviality at Jesus' expense, but my eye couldn't draw itself away from Jesus. He stood there, quietly, waiting for Herod to finish his games without any reaction to the things being said to and about him. It was as if he had anticipated this moment and was just waiting for it to pass. His absolute composure in the moment, even while he held his side in pain, was absolutely enthralling. So much so that I missed a barb that Herod thought I would find particularly amusing. Realizing my error, I quickly, if not half-heartedly, chuckled to appease my friend of so many years. Having had his fun, Herod informed the elders that Jesus was none of his business and to return to Pilate if they wanted to continue to pursue charges. The elders' countenances dropped into absolute vexation, as I could see they were hoping this would be the end of their dealings with Jesus. The jests they had shared with Herod at Jesus' expense had gained them nothing but a long walk back to their home province. They quickly shuffled out the door and took their gathering crowd with them back onto the road to Pilate's door. I looked at my friend. He was still guffawing at the hilarity he found in this whole situation. I was lost as to what good his entertainment would do for me in the long run. As the day was drawing on, I offered Herod my thanks for his hospitality and took my leave. While he seemed somewhat surprised at my quick departure, he did not inquire further and bid me good day. I found myself following the crowd as we all returned to our home district.
I spent the entire journey to Herod's whisper shouting my brother's name. I somehow needed to get his attention and pull him away from Jesus and Father so I could talk to him without alerting Father to his presence. My efforts got me nowhere, for the noise of the crowd talking and shuffling along always overcame my single voice. Arriving at Herod's door, the crowd fanned out to span the front of his home. As the elders and Jesus entered, groups ran to the nearest windows to try and hear what was transpiring inside the house. In all of the shifting, I lost Jacob. In that moment, I wished I was as tall as that man in the crowd I'd hid behind the other day. Then I could have just looked over the crowd to find him. I knew Jacob would stay near to the man he was putting everything on the line for. The amount of risk he'd already taken on Jesus' behalf told me that my brother was no longer the boy I had known. He was making decisions about his life that he couldn't undo. I moved to try and get close to the window that most were trying to gather around. I just knew that he would be there. A short distance from the window, I spotted Jacob, and I knew that this was the moment that I had to grab him. He had his back to me, and he was talking among a group of men that I had never seen before. I put my hand on the shoulder of a man in my path to Jacob, and I was just going to ask him to move. Then the man turned, and to my misfortune, he recognized me. He was one of the vendors that Father often bought from. I had spent hours in his shop going over details and purchases. He knew Father was an elder, and he instantly assumed that I was in the crowd to support Father. He began a diatribe of thoughts and questions about Jesus and what Father had spoken about him, and if I knew what the plans were. He praised Father for what he had done and was glad that they were taking steps to get rid of the nuisance. In the midst of the rambling, I kept my eye on Jacob, though. He had not moved. He was right there in the window, just listening to the random rounds of laughter that came through the opening. Then I had a thought. If I moved to him then, that man would know, and then the news would eventually get back to Father that I spoke to Jacob. If Jacob had any hope of returning home to Father's good graces, it had to be as if he was never part of that scene. So, I resigned myself to the conversation I was stuck in, and I did my best to give vague answers to his query. It wasn't long before the group of elders exited the residence. News traveled back through the crowd that Herod had turned them away and sent them back to Pilate. What a mess this was becoming. The crowd moved to follow the men and Jesus yet again. I saw Jacob and his group quickly shuffle to be near Jesus again. The old vendor kept talking my ear off. Every thought about what was going on was coming out of his mouth. And as he slowly began to trail the majority of the crowd, pulling me along with him, I resigned myself to the fact that I would not be able to get Jacob as long as this mass of people kept moving around the city. I would have to find another time to pull him aside.
It was all becoming a spectacle. Yet again, we were paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, elders, Jesus, and the still growing crowd of people. The larger the crowd grew, and the later in the day it became, the more that tempers began to flare, and the louder the cries of "Kill him!" and "Down with the traitor" became. I just couldn't believe it. Arriving back at Pilate's stoop, the elders once again sought to pull him from his work to bring condemnation upon Jesus. Pilate, escorted by his guards, walked out the front door and observed the mass of humanity standing 4 steps below him yet again. He looked at the elders, at Jesus, and combed his eyes over the crowd as if to assess the mindset of the people. He announced that he had already not found any reason to bring charges against Jesus and that Herod had confirmed his decision. With that statement, the crowd turned on him. The yelling and chanting for Jesus' death began anew. Some even began begging for Pilate to take Jesus and release a rebel named Barabbas. I recalled he had been convicted of murder and rebellion, and I couldn't understand why they would want him roaming the streets of Jerusalem instead of Jesus. Those of us there for Jesus did our best to petition for mercy, but it was obvious that we were outnumbered. As the noise became deafening, Pilate raised his hands to quiet the crowd. He asked again and again why he should punish a man he had found no guilt in. But the majority of the crowd would not be satiated with anything less than Jesus' death. As all of this back and forth was happening, I couldn't help but be drawn to Jesus. He had been pushed up onto the steps beside Pilate and was being held in place by a couple of the elders. He just stood there. His face looked resigned, as if he had no choice but to let these things continue. Stooped in pain as he was, he continually looked out over the crowd, scanning the faces of humanity, calling for his death. It was the same face I had seen him make when he tried to explain some great truth, and those listening didn't understand. A mix of frustration, pity, and love. This man was remarkable, falsely accused, beaten, broken, and paraded through the streets like a criminal. And yet he still found it within himself to look upon his people with love. How could they not see that he was God in the flesh? For what mere man would be able to conjure up anything other than contempt for those seeking his death?
Something drove me to follow the crowd even when I should have turned and headed home. Witnessing what I did at Herod's home, there in that cold room, I felt some sort of investment in what was to come of this man. I stayed behind the crowd as I knew they would not welcome a Roman among them, regardless of their thoughts on Jesus. How things had changed for these people from a few days ago. As large as this crowd had become, it was still no bigger than the one at the gates when he rode in on that donkey. I had to think that some of them, calling for his death now, were shouting, "Hosanna," and laying palms at his feet not even a week ago. I was surprised with myself that I didn't find it more amusing. Why Herod's barbs at Jesus' expense didn't satisfy me in any way. Maybe it was because he didn't fight back. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him, waiting. His people in the crowd were trying to no avail to convince Pilate of his innocence. There were much louder cries for him to be traded out for that rebel and murderer Barabbas. As I stood there watching Pilate consider the trade, I began to realize that none of this made any sense. Sure, Jesus had stirred up trouble at the temple, and maybe he'd convinced a sizable enough crowd to follow him that the elders may have felt uncomfortable. But to be willing to trade his life for that mass murderer? It hadn't been that long since I remember the absolute terror that Barabbas had inflicted on Jerusalem. He was a zealot of the worst order and saw no harm in a few deaths if it advanced his agenda. The Jewish people were terrified of him, and so were Roman citizens. He and his men wreaked havoc in my markets and set fire to numerous establishments in the Roman quarter. Upon his capture, the entire city took a collective breath of relief. It was one of the few things that we Romans and Jews agreed on. Barabbas never needed to see the light of day again. It was at that moment I realized I had spent hours following the events around Jesus and hadn't even thought about my market stands. Normally, it was the first thing on my mind as I rose. I would choke down breakfast so I could get to my ledgers and check the numbers. But my concern for all of that had been overridden by what I was witnessing at that moment. The Jewish people had just chosen a terrorist over Jesus. I watched as they manhandled Jesus through a side door, and the crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of, "Crucify him! Crucify him!"
They shoved him through a door, and we could not see him any longer. Not long after, I watched as Barabbas was led through the same door. His shackles were removed, and he triumphantly joined the crowd that had been screaming for his release. Those of us from the camp stood in utter shock. What did they think Jesus had done that deserved the most cruel form of death instead of Barabbas? News of Barabbas' reign of terror had spread far and wide. Everyone knew what he was capable of. They preferred a return to fear and death over Jesus? The elders had always hated Jesus' teaching, but among those calling for his death at that moment were faces I had seen at the gates just a few days ago, praising Jesus as Hosanna, King of Kings. My heart was breaking. Mary found me and pulled me over to a group of other women from the camp. They had all decided to see this thing through no matter how it ended and would stick together for safety. I could do nothing less but join them. All the things Jesus had done for us, the things he had redeemed each of those women from, we could find the strength to walk this road for him.
I watched as Father got his victory. The Romans hauled Jesus off, and the elders turned to the mass of people in triumph. As the lead elders remained on the stair talking to Pilate, Father and a few others dispersed into the crowd. Fearing that he would run into Jacob, I tore myself from the constant conversation of our old vendor friend and made my way to Father. He was happier than I had seen him in days. He embraced me with a joy that was almost unsettling. I understood the relief that came from being done with the trouble that Jesus had caused for him, but it was not typical for my father to revel in death as he was. He explained now that the Romans would see Jesus crucified. They had taken him away to prepare for just that. He and the elders would stick around to follow Jesus up to Golgotha to ensure the deed was completed and that any other dissension in the crowd was silenced. He wanted me to join him at his side, and he made no mention of Jacob as he pulled me along with him.
It felt like the crowd had waited for hours outside the door through which Jesus had been taken. But watching the sun in its course, I knew the time only just felt like it was drawing on. I meandered through the crowd, trying not to stay in one place for very long, and knowing my presence wasn't very welcome. One would think that very knowledge would have made me move on, but I was drawn in irrevocably. There was one Jewish man standing to the side of the crowd with me, a bag laid over his shoulder. He and I made eye contact, and I was surprised at his friendly response. He stepped towards me and asked for an update on what was happening. He had come into the city after word had spread about Jesus' arrest. Jesus had taught in his hometown not 2 weeks ago, and he was surprised that events had turned so quickly against this man that he saw as only a kind and gentle teacher. I was almost taken aback at how casually he spoke with me. I couldn't even find it in the moment to be insulted at his lack of deference to my status as a Roman. At that point, it was just nice to not feel like such an outsider in this crowd of mostly Jews. I found it odd that this man and I were both standing there, enthralled at the events surrounding Jesus. He was a rural Jew of little means, dusty and dirty from his trek into the city. I was an upper-class Roman who rarely gave the Jews a second thought. But there in the streets of Jerusalem, we were united in our curiosity. As we cordially chatted about the events of the day, the creaking of the gates being opened drew our attention. The crowd around us broke into an immediate mix of gasps and cheers. The man and I stood there waiting to see what the rest of the crowd had already seen. As the crowd parted, a contingent of Roman guards and leadership began walking toward the hill they used to crucify the guilty. The man and I stood there as the guards passed us, the metal plates of their armor clanging a discordant sound as, behind them, 3 men followed with large beams thrown over their backs. 2 of those men looked disheveled from many days spent in Roman prison, but managed to bear the burden of the beam with enough strength to proceed. But as they passed us, and the 3rd man trudged behind, he collapsed into the dusty road under the weight of his burden. Blood dripping from where they had shoved a mocking crown of thorns into his scalp, I realized that man was Jesus. Who else would the Romans mock with a crown of humiliation and pain than the one they found guilty of falsely claiming to be a king? To my right, I heard the clanging of armor intensify, and the man I had been conversing with was hauled from the crowd and commanded by the guard to pick up Jesus' beam. In such utter shock, he dropped his satchel on the ground at my feet. The guard shoved Jesus back to his feet and into motion as the man walked a few steps behind him, carrying the beam. Tearing my eyes away from what was happening in front of me, I bent down and grabbed the man's bag. I hadn't even taken the time to get his name or what city he was from. If I didn't carry his satchel to him, it would be ultimately trampled and lost under the feet of the crowd following Jesus up that hill. I guess I could repay him for his kindness by ensuring that the bag got back to him. I tucked the bag into my chest and began to ascend the hill.
It was so hard to look at him. I thought the elders had done the worst they could to him. But as he exited the gates of the Roman prison, seeing what the Romans had done to his back took my breath away. His tunic was gone, and his back had been ripped and torn by their instruments of torture. Aside from the one cloth left to protect what little dignity he had left, he wore a crown around his head that had been dug so far into his flesh, blood streaming from every puncture. They had brutalized him beyond anything I could imagine a human was capable of. As he stumbled through the gates, the pain read clearly on his face from the huge beam that rested across the open wounds on his shoulders. I shouldn't have been surprised as he collapsed under the weight and straining of holding up the very wood he would soon be nailed to. Tears were already streaming down my eyes. I looked at Mary and the other women around me, and they were in the same state of grief. And I noticed, for the first time, there amidst the gathering of women, was the other Mary, his mother Mary. She walked hidden by the other women that surrounded her. Small in stature, she was easy to overlook, but her countenance was that of a man twice her size. Her grief was palpable, but so was her resolve to follow every step her son took. I did not know her personally, but her presence was a comfort to me all the same. It was then that I was shocked to hear Jesus' voice. Peeling my eyes from Mary, I looked to see my Savior, despite all the pain and suffering that he was enduring in the moment, address us women as we walked near him. In his usual manner, he talked in what some would have thought to be riddles, talking of green wood and dry wood, but to those of us that had followed him for such a long time, we knew his words. In one quick allegory, he was assuring us that his death was to prevent the death of us all, that he had to take on the judgment of God to save us from that very same judgment. I knew it was also a reminder to hold fast and to not let ourselves become overwhelmed in our grief. He had revealed his utmost purpose to us in that moment, and we were all in awe.
We'd walked at the front of the processional all the way to the top of the hill. Father made sure we stood in the path that Jesus would take to his cross. As the guards marched by us, paying us little regard, one of the criminals that followed them yelled his disdain for the elders and the Romans alike. Amidst the ruckus that he was stirring, I looked a few paces back down the hill to see Jesus walking next to a man carrying his crossbeam. As the two men trudged along, urged by the guards behind them, Jesus was addressing a small group of women to his right. How did he find the strength to draw enough breath to speak? Even at that distance, I could tell the Romans had done every form of torture imaginable to him. How was he even conscious? I heard my father snort at my side. He was still finding so much satisfaction from Jesus being brought so low. The guards escorted Jesus to the beam upon which he would hang, and I watched the man drop the crossbeam in the dust nearby and retreat into the crowd. The guards stretched Jesus' arms and nailed horrible metal spikes into his wrists. The cries of agony, I'm sure, could be heard all the way to the foot of the hill we stood upon. And as my father looked on in triumph, I found it hard to keep my eyes open. I squeezed my eyes shut and rubbed the bridge of my nose with my fingers. This is all wrong. My father standing here so proud, my brother somewhere in the crowd among Jesus' followers, mother at home no doubt wrecked with anxiety and fear, and I felt like I was caught in a whirlwind.
I remained close to the man whose bag I carried. As he stepped back into the crowd, I handed him his bag. In shock at my carrying his bag, or at what he had just experienced, I could not tell. He nodded his thanks and slung the bag back over his shoulder. We stood there watching as they laid Jesus on that blood-soaked beam my people had become well known for using. I had always avoided witnessing the torturous death men suffered on these things. Stories I had heard of bones broken, men gasping for breath until they asphyxiated, bodies burnt from sun exposure and lack of water. It was nothing I had desired to see. I still didn't want to see it. As they drove nails into his wrists and prepared to stand the cross up, I felt my stomach knot. Something in me had thought this man would call out in his godlike power and be freed from the torture. All of the stories I heard passed through the crowds of things he had supposedly done. Was there not room for one more last-minute miracle? But as each grueling iron rod pierced his body, he endured. Do something, man. Why won't you save yourself? As the upright beam with Jesus' body settled into its place, Jesus lifted his broken body enough to take a breath and proclaim over the noise of the crowd, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." At his words, the air was ripped from my lungs. I was drawn back to that lesson he was teaching at the temple about the vineyard. It wasn't ever about lost prophets or workers, as I was so foolish to believe then. I realized I was witnessing prophecy fulfilled. Jesus had predicted his own people would kill him. Jesus was the heir sent to reap a harvest from his Father's fields. And if I believed all of that was true about him, I had no choice but to believe he was everything he claimed to be. I saw with new eyes what was transpiring around me. The Jews had taken their last hope and just slaughtered it on a Roman cross. Not just the Jews, but my people played a part as well. I fell to my knees, utterly undone. The man whose bag I had carried bent down and wordlessly laid a hand of comfort on my shoulder. Everything I left inside the gates of that city that I loved so much lost all importance in that moment. What I was witnessing was life-altering. I knew I would descend this hill a different man than I was when I first stepped foot on it. Jesus wasn't just here for the Jews. Somehow, some way, I knew he had come for me too.
There was my Savior, broken, bleeding, hung on a cross. The Roman guards were laughing at him, mocking him. The Jewish elders stood huddled in a haughty mass of self-assurance. I stayed by Mary's side as she attempted to keep Jesus' mother on her feet. A few men drew close, and I recognized them from among his closest friends. They too comforted Mary and sought to protect her from the crowd. Jesus' people were gathered on that hill together, comforting each other, holding each other up. What we were witnessing was horrible and life-shattering, but there was still a sense that together we could make it through. We all stood there as Jesus asked God to forgive those who were actively killing him. I couldn't help but wonder how close I came to being numbered among them. The minute I began to doubt his purpose, his calling upon my life, could I have been one to call for his death? I looked around the gathered crowd, Jews and Romans, rich, poor, male and female made up the mass of humanity. At that moment, I knew that Jesus looked down upon us from the cross, seeing no difference. He was there to die for every person in the crowd, even the ones that openly hated and scorned him. With a shuddering breath, I clasped my hands together and began to pray.
Father joined the crowd jeering at Jesus. I stood by his side in silence as the events of the day weighed heavy on my mind. Never once had Jesus jeered back. Never once had he looked at my father with the hatred like I saw in my father's eyes at that very moment. And when he looked up to the heavens as he hung there to ask God to forgive those who had crucified him, I was caught in a chasm between expectations and encounter with something so thoroughly new it had drawn a line in the sand for me. I stood there watching as Jesus conversed with the other men hanging on the crosses around him. Even unto the edge of death, he was forgiving this one man of his sins and promising him a place in heaven. Would any human man be able to carry on the ruse this long? Why was it worth keeping it up at this point? The elders had won, hadn't they? I couldn't take it anymore. Father's expectations, the role I had to play, my brother, and how much this Jesus had shaken up my family. Stepping back from my father's side, I tore my eyes from those 3 bloody crosses and slipped quietly back down the hill. It was just all too much. How much did you want from me? How much was I expected to endure? I realized as I withdrew that I didn't know if I was asking those questions to my father or to Jesus.
I watched as my brother descended the hill. I wasn't even aware he was part of the crowd that had been following the events surrounding Jesus until we arrived there. I could read on his face every thought in his head. He had ascended the hill at Father's side. He had ascended the hill fulfilling his duty as the firstborn son. He had ascended the hill and come face to face with a reckoning he was not ready for. It was still hard for me to accept that my own father was responsible for putting Jesus on that cross. I had tried to explain to Joseph that Jesus was different. I was hoping that he could help me convince Father of the same. Clearly, though, Joseph was not ready for what Jesus was doing. That day at the gates changed me forever. I had spent my entire life chafing at the idea of being the second-born son. Nothing to inherit, nothing to bring honor to my father. That was Joseph's place. Knowing I could never measure up, I chose to embrace being the troublemaker. I reveled in seeing what I could get away with and in making Father angry at my antics. But as I mockingly bowed to lay that palm frond in front of that donkey and turned my eyes up to the man astride it, I came face to face with much more than a man. He looked down at me and smiled. There was no reaction of anger or frustration or negativity like I had grown so accustomed to in my life. He just smiled, and that smile seemed to communicate he knew me inside and out. As my friends derided me for putting a stop to our antics, I still felt completely drawn in by his presence. I followed his people through the gates and sat under his teaching for hours each day following. I prayed for my father, my mother, my brother. I wanted them to see in him what I saw. I wanted them to see that all the ceremony, the pretense, the pomp and performance could finally end. I wanted them so bad to see that their Savior was here in their presence. He had warned us that the message he came to bring would tear families apart. I stood there on that hill as he was dying, mourning the fact that my family was one of them. My father jeering as, for Jesus, each breath became harder to draw. My brother turning his back and walking away. And my mother. I looked at Jesus' mother standing there, watching the baby that she had swaddled, the child she had comforted, the man she had encouraged and loved and supported, die so horribly. She knew from the time he shared her womb that he would come to change the world. Did she know that was how it would be done? The sky grew dark, and it drew me back to Jesus there on the cross. As the ground began to tremble under my feet, Jesus cried out,
"Father, into your hands I present my spirit."
And with that, he breathed his last. The crowd was silent. The elders and Romans had ceased their mockery. The sobs and crying of his followers had turned to absolute shock. The air seemed ripped from everyone's lungs. Out of the vacuum, I heard a cry from the most unexpected of places. At the foot of the cross, a centurion stood staring up at Jesus. His metal garb clanged as he dropped to his knees, and there in the dust, before any of Jesus' followers could form words to speak, he loudly proclaimed, "Praise be to God! This man was innocent!" He was innocent. And his innocent blood had just been shed to provide me, a second-born son with a bad reputation of my own making, an equal inheritance to everyone gathered there at his feet that chose to believe he was who he had always claimed to be, our Messiah.
A Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide, is written and produced by Kelly Duke, with editing and oversight by Philip Larson. Vocal talents provided by Brett Bauer, Tony Gregory, Randy Kemp, and Mary C. Bruce. Theme music written by Danny Lee, Andy Dixon, Scott Garnan, and Stephen Gray, and performed by the West Metro Worship Collective. Background instrumentals provided by Higher Power. Discussion and insight questions by Ryan Abernathy. Sound editing by Ron Duke.